to the albums and all this stuff, there's something amiss about the whole Van Halen breakup with Dave. And let me tell you why. Because during the time of, let's say, 1982, during Diver Down, the record company wanted them to do a single to kind of hold over the fans until the next record. So they did the Pretty Woman single, right? After Fair Warning wasn't doing that well sales-wise, which is really strange because Fair Warning is known as one of their best albums, if not their best album. So it's a little weird. It seemed like it suffered from the times, that 80s time. It's almost like maybe Fair Warning was a little more leftover 70s feel. They were moving into the 80s and the times were moving forward, and maybe that style of rock was not in favor at that particular time, and maybe that's why the sales weren't there. And we all know that Ed threw himself so deeply into that record, and as time went on, he really enjoyed the success of it in the sense that fans really discovered that album later on in his career. It is known usually as the top, if either number one or number two, as the best Van Halen album, so it's typically right up there. Do you think that when they went into the Diver Down project and they did, Pretty Woman just to satisfy the record company, and then the record company, wanted an album quick because Pretty Woman was a hit, and they ended up throwing a lot of covers on Diver Down, it became a little bit of the Ted and Dave show, and that angered Ed, causing him to draw the line in the sand, build 5150, and then there became two camps, Ed and Don Landy, and Dave and Ted Templeman. Do you think that divide with Dave wasn't so much just Dave and his ego? We all know Dave has a monstrous ego. That's without question. It's like the sun rises and sets every day. But, it seems a little bit like it was fueled with Ted. And I'll tell you why. Because it seems like Ted was very upset with the whole Don Landy situation. You remember, Don Landy was Ted's partner in terms of producing. He totally sided with Ed and became like a team with Ed. And they built 5150, and when Ed turned around and told him he was not going to record at Sunset Sound, that they were going to actually record the album at 5150, Ted kind of got his back up a little bit and was like, wait a minute. Then when things went on and they were hiding the tapes, the story about the master tapes, and Ted ends up missing the deadline for the album with the record company. Remember, Ted's a record executive on top of being a producer. That kind of makes him look bad in terms of Warner Brothers. He's not delivering on the band he's supposed to be controlling. And it seems to be that there's a little bit of a back and forth there with Ted. I almost feel like, if it's possible, that the Crazy from the Heat EP from 1985 was kind of Ted's getting back a little bit at Ed because of the way Ed and Don took complete control of 1984. And don't get me wrong, they did an unbelievable job, and it was incredibly successful, and Ed was totally right to do what he did. No one's doubting that. But it just seems like Ted, to this day, in his own book, cites that he can't stand Jump. Now, Jump is not only a hit of the times, it has become an anthem for the fucking decade. So, and it still is played constantly every day and at sporting events, and is a symbol of a whole era of music. I'm not saying that's Van Halen's best song or anything, but it is what it became. There's something there that I almost feel like, if you look at the amount of attention and money and backing that EP got, the Crazy from the Heat EP, with the videos, with the David Letterman appearance, with the cover of Rolling Stone, which Van Halen never even got at that time. Dave's on the cover of Rolling Stone. He's on David Letterman. He's all over MTV. He's hosting things on MTV. It just seems like someone was moving chess pieces behind the curtain. And it just seemed a little strange. How is it that Van Halen's record company, Warner Brothers, Van Halen's producer, Ted Templeman, and Van Halen's lead singer, David Lee Roth, was putting this entire project together behind their back and they didn't know about it? How is that possible?
You mean, how did Van Halen not know about it?
The entire Crazy from the Heat EP, with the videos and the recording and all of that stuff, there was budget for that. That was all set up. The whole band didn't even know what was going on.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, Dave. I mean, I think some of your observations, I mean, they probably are true. And again, in the book, Ed talks about Ted, and he says some things. He was always quick to give Ted his kudos, but there were moments that Ted really angered him and shortchanged Edward's input and didn't value it. And that disrespect is something that that's what cut into him so deeply. Ed was a huge champion of Crazy from the Heat. I remember I said, what did you think about the record? He said, hey, man, it's good. Typical Van Halen style. Van Halen fans will eat it up, When Dave first went out and did it, before Dave decided to walk away, Ed was all for it. I said, did Dave ask to help him do any writing or anything? I said, no, his own thing, So Dave, who doesn't really write songs per se, did the 4 covers. But, I mean, was it anything like a revenge from Ted? I don't think so. Ed never said that kind of thing to me. It was just Dave was starting to say things around that time. I ran into Dave somewhere. Dave always said, well, even if I'd never been a Van Halen man, that record would have done what it did. I mean, see, that's the point that nobody gets or they forget about. Had Dave been some singer who came out with that record, that would have been another Warner's release. There would have been returns. And, again, if nobody knew that if David Lee Roth had not been the singer for Van Halen, and again, it's impossible to hear that record and not make that connection. But would Dave had even an iota of that success? I don't think so.
All right. Well, let me ask you this. In terms of the Sammy situation, why did Ted call up Sammy and kind of whisper in his ear to let him know that Van Halen was on the outs with Dave?
Here we go.
Why would he stir that pot? It just seemed to me like Ted was a little bit orchestrating Sammy coming into the band. He had just worked with him on VOA, and the whole Claudio Zampoli story seems a little bit storybook to me. Don't you think that he might have had a bit of a hand in that?
Ed never said anything like that to me. I asked him, Ed, did you really, be introduced to Sammy through your mechanic? And he said, yeah. We all know Ed was a fan of Montrose, so obviously he knew who Sammy Hagar was.
Right, yeah.
But I remember Ed, there was a period before Ed got Sammy, he said, hey, man, go find me a singer. And I mean, I don't think Ed had that Machiavellian sensibility about him to orchestrate those things. I think Ed was a more simple thinker in those terms. I mean, even though you think that anybody in the world would wanted to have been the singer in Van Halen, but I don't think Ed really understood or knew how to go out there and find a singer. Setting up auditions, I mean, the management should have been doing that stuff, and they fucked him over. I write about that as well. I remember Ed said, I think it was before he got together with Sammy the first time when Sammy was going to come by 5150 and jam. Ed said, I can't stand Sammy's writing. He says, I hate his solo song. I said, wow. He goes, yeah. He says, but he's a really good singer. And then I remember talking to Ed after the first time they jammed, and Ed said, man, it was unbelievable. So I don't know, Dave. I mean, again, these are things that I never talked to Ed about. I would only be theorizing.
Actually, I'm glad you gave the answers you gave, Steve, because maybe my partner Dave here can finally go to bed tonight and realize that there was not a great conspiracy.
No, I'm not buying it.
Let me finish.
Finish, please.
You had your soapbox
go ahead.
For like 10 whole minutes.
All right, go ahead.
Okay?
Please.
So maybe you can go to bed tonight.
Yeah.
And know there wasn't this great conspiracy to pump out Dave's solo album, split up the band, and get Sammy into it. It just was one of those things. Bands break up all the time, and they just got Sammy in the band because the car mechanic happened to know a guy. And that's it. I'm sorry it wasn't anything more complex than that, Dave.
One final thing here. You'll read about Ed talking about Ted. I mean, he tells me things about Ted, and then Ted comes back to do the...
For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge album.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, for Unlawful right?
Yeah.
So after all this shit, and you cannot believe the stuff that Ed was telling you about Ted. And then you will not believe the stuff he says about Dave, and he gets back together with Dave for the reunion.
Yeah.
So I say those things because I don't think Ed had any inclination beyond the music that he played. I really don't think he had any deviousness, anything going on about getting Sammy or orchestrating that. I mean, these are my feelings. About Dave, he was so fucking mad at Dave, and yet he got together with the reunion. The point being, I think Ed was probably the most forgiving person on the planet. I mean, he put up with Dave and Mike for years and years and years and years. And, you know,
when Sammy came into the band, he sort of took control of the band. When he first came in, I mean, he took the job as the lead singer of Van Halen, but hardly was doing any Van Halen back catalog on stage, and even had the balls to implement his own solo material into the Van Halen show. What did you make of that?
Okay, you bring up an excellent point. I didn't specifically ask Ed about Sammy doing his solo stuff during a Van Halen show, but I remember Ed saying to me, yeah, you know, I'm working on Sammy's solo record. And I thought, Sammy's solo record? Ed, you didn't fucking tell the guy that he can't do solo records or have his solo career while he's a singer in Van Halen? You know, and my thought was, how the fuck could Ed allow that?
Because it was contractual. Because it was a contractual agreement in order to get Sammy out of his Geffen contract.
That's horseshit, Dave. I mean, this is Eddie Van Halen we're talking about. Had Van Halen played hardball, and I know that Sammy was contractually obligated to Geffen.
Yeah.
Look, man, numbers make the world go round. They could have worked out something. I truly believe it.
Yeah,
but the reality is, Sammy kept doing solo records for the next 10 years. Sammy was a solo artist playing part-time in Van Halen. Sammy was never a part of that band, no matter what he says. And I love Sammy. I think he's a very cool guy. I think his work ethic was amazing, though Edward will tell me a lot of things about his work ethic. But Sammy never quit his solo career. What is that? Not like Dave, who had been in the band for, 6 or 7 records and then did a solo record. And that goes back to my point. Ed was the most forgiving person on the planet. You think you could have been the bass player in U2 and say, hey, I got to do a solo record now, guys, I'll see you in 2 months. I don't think so. And I talked to Ed about that. I go, Ed, why would you do that? I think he said something about the contractual thing or, the fact that he was producing the record. So it's like a little bit of his hand still in there. I don't know what it was. But,
the bottom line was Warner Brothers made a deal with Geffen Records. Geffen not only got 50% of 5150's gross, they also got a solo album out of Sammy, which Ed produced. They also got a greatest hits with 2 new songs. And the only solo records that Sammy released during his time in Van Halen were those 2 contractually obligated things. So that's the thing. Sammy had a lot of personal issues to deal with during his time in Van Halen with his wife and his other wife and all their kinds of personal issues. He's having a kid or his wife was having issues, and there was a lot of that kinds of stuff. Let me ask you this. Back in the 90s, the early 90s, with the whole Cabo Wabo deal, do you think that's what soured his relationship with Sam? Because the band had invested in Cabo Wabo when it really wasn't doing that good, and then when the band pulled out, Cabo Wabo blew up and Sammy made millions off of it? Do you think that soured their relationship?
I don't think so. Ed talked a little bit about that, and I don't really think that had anything to do with it. I mean, it may have. I mean, it's a money thing. Ed certainly didn't need the money by then. Sammy wanting his solo career first and Van Halen second. And Ed was aware of some of those things, Sammy was going through. And he says, man, take care of your business. Sammy was not giving his all to Van Halen. And for Ed, that's the kiss of death. When you disrespect Van Halen, you're disrespecting Edward and his music and his life and his love. And that's the one thing he could not tolerate. I know there's been a lot of different versions of what happened at the end there. And Ed went into pretty acute detail of, Sammy and singing on those songs and, bringing in the other songwriter that worked with him on those 2 or 3 songs that Dave ended up singing. I'm sorry, man, I can't think of the amazing songwriter, Sammy insulting him, the whole Twister thing. I just don't think that Ed had any reason to lie to me. He could have. He'd never lied to me before about really personal stuff. So, when he tells me, what he said and what he did and what he didn't do, I believe him. I don't think the Cabo Wabo thing had anything to do with it.
Do you think hiring Ray Daniels as the manager was a mistake?
I do. And there's another perfect example of Ed not thinking in terms of, Ray Daniels, that's Sammy's manager, and he just did not think like that.
Well, no, he wasn't Sammy's manager. Sammy's manager was Ed Loeffler, who took over.
All right, sorry.
Right, yeah. Ed Loeffler obviously was the one who came in 5150, OU 812 for unlawful common knowledge. Then he died during the live album, after the live album tour. I'm talking about Ray Daniels, who came in during Balance, during Van Halen 3. He was the manager during that time. He was Alex's brother-in-law.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about him a little bit until things went